CBSE Board, Class 9, History, Chapter 2, Part 9, Audio by Rini Matthew. We saw that there were 4 points which took place on February 22nd, and now we have to take a look at what really happened between these attempts. Okay, so there was a big commotion which happened on February 22nd, and the supplies were cut across the Baltic Sea, and after that it triggered off lot of riots. The winter was really cold and people were already facing shortage, and we took a look at the Winter Palace of St. Petersburg. And then all these 4 points also we saw where the workers started crossing from the factory quarters to the center capital, the Nevsky Prospect. Now, as a continuation of this particular slide, let's see what happened next. The fashionable quarters were there, official banks were also there on the left-hand side of that river bank, Neva. That was surrounded by the workers from the right-hand side of the bank. And what happened as a result of that? The government imposed a curfew. There was a strong curfew imposed, and demonstrators dispersed by the evening because there was nothing else that could be helped out with, and they were forced to flee from that particular site. But what happened after that? They came back on the 24th and 25th. It's not that they just gave up on the whole right, because they had planned for it, and it is because they were running short of bread. They were running short of food. What did the government do? The government called out the cavalry and police to keep an eye on them. So it's not that the government also kept quiet. They were also a bit scared on what the people are going to do next. Because when the factory workers get together, anything can happen. So they were against the government, and they also kept an eye on them. On Sunday, that is on 25th of February, it's not that the revolution has stopped. On 25th, the government suspended the Duma. So maybe this is the third body of the Duma. So that was suspended on 25th of February. And politicians spoke out against this measure. They were not happy with that, and some of the politicians were also not happy that it was suspended. So what happened? The demonstrators returned in force. They came back on 24th and 25th, and they came back again on 26th to the streets of the left bank, where you have the government buildings, the fashionable quarters, the Winter Palace, and all that. On 27th, the police headquarters were ransacked. The streets thronged with people, raising slogans about bread, wages, better hours, and democracy. So police headquarters were ransacked, very natural of what happened in France. And then the streets thronged with people. They were against those who hoarded bread but did not give them, those who did not raise the wages, who wanted them to work for longer hours but did not compensate for what they did. They did not pay them for the work that they give. The government tried to control the situation and called out the cavalry once again. So once again they were organizing cavalry. They wanted to hush up the people, but the cavalry refused this time to fire on the demonstrators, because it is by force that they are doing it. So maybe they also were convinced that it is the right step that they have taken. So this time, the cavalry did not obey the government and they did not fire on them. So that was a plus point for these workers, and justice was on their side. Another officer was shot at the barracks of a regiment, and 3 other regiments mutinied, voting to join the striking workers. So when one officer was shot, there was a group which was formed, and they also decided to join this group of striking workers instead of shooting at them. And on the same evening, soldiers, striking workers had gathered to form a Soviet or council. So that is the beginning of Soviet. The word Soviet comes into being, and they formed the Soviet, who all formed the soldiers and the workers from the factories. And that too they formed in the same building as the Duma met. I showed you the picture of how the Duma was met. So there itself they formed, and this was the Petrograd Soviet, because it took place in sent Petrograd. So this was the Petrograd Soviet, very important turning point in the history of Russia. The very next day, a delegation went to see the Tsar because they have to bring everything to the notice of the Tsar, and he was also not interested in taking part or seeing what was happening with the workers and how many people were joining against him. So all of them started marching and they went to meet the Tsar. Military commanders advised him to abdicate. He followed their advice and abdicated on 2nd March. So military commanders also joined this group and he was asked to abdicate. Soviet leaders and Duma leaders, there were two different groups. It's not that, of course, they worked together, but their disciplines were different and they joined together. The Soviet leaders was formed immediately after the February Revolution, but Duma was already there from the beginning. So they formed a provisional government. It was not something which was going to take over Russia. That is why it's known as the provisional, temporary government with a new discipline and ideology to run the country, who are the Soviet leaders and the Duma leaders. Russia's future would be decided by a constituent assembly elected on the basis of universal adult suffrage. So that will be decided by the Constituent Assembly and not by one particular person. That was the first point that they had put forward. Petrograd had led the February Revolution that brought down the monarchy in February 1917. So one successful point is it was going to be run by a Constituent Assembly and the monarchy was brought down in February 1917. So that was the end of the February Revolution and the beginning of another era in Russia. Now there's a source box which is given in your textbook, the women in the February Revolution. So let's see how the women workers responded, whether like the people in France, we don't know. So there was a person known as Marfa Vasileva. Okay, so we saw that the International Women's Day was celebrated when the women also joined the factory workers to march during the February Revolution. Now, women workers, they were often inspired by their male co-workers when they worked in the factories, especially in the Lawrence telephone factory. So this particular woman, almost single-handed, she called for a successful strike. And already in the morning of the celebration of the Women's Day, this happened during the February Revolution, okay? Women workers had presented red balls to the men to encourage them. And then what did Marfa do? She, a milling machine operator, stopped work and declared an impromptu strike, which happens all of a sudden, was not planned. So when she told that we're going to get together for a strike, what happened? The workers on the floor were ready to support her. The foreman informed the management and sent her a loaf of bread. So people thought that she was going to fight for bread, but that was not her motive. She really wanted to stand against what was happening in Russia. So what did she do? She took the bread but refused to go back to work. Okay? And her problem was something else and not bread. The administrator asked her again why she refused to work, and she replied, I cannot be the only one who is satiated when others are hungry. I cannot be satisfied when others are hungry. I cannot be satisfied. I cannot work when my whole countrymen are suffering. That was her answer, and she coined this particular strike. Now, the women workers from another section of the factory gathered around Marfa in support. So both men and women were supporting her. Gradually, everybody ceased working, looking at her. They all stopped working and joined the strike. Soon the men downed their tools as well, and the entire crowd rushed onto the street. So that is how she brought everybody to the street. You should understand that everything took place from the factory on the right-hand side of the bank of River Neva. So it's not that everybody was informed well in advance that you should come to the streets and fight against the people. It's not like that. So some people like this, like Marfa, there are 2-3 people like the revolutionaries who encouraged the others to come to the street. So the source of this particular incident is from Choi Chatterjee, celebrating women. So you should also keep in mind that the Women's Day was celebrated then in Russia. After February, what was the consequence? Did the government do anything apart from dismissing the monarchy? That was the end of the monarchy and also the formation of a new constituent government. But after February, still things continued. Let's see what happened. The army officials, landowners and industrialists were influential in the provincial government. So even though the new government was formed, these people from the higher strata of the society, who all are they? The army officials, landowners and industrialists. They were deeply influenced by this government. But what happened to the liberals? The liberals, as well as socialists among them, worked towards an elected government. You should remember that this was not an elected government. Which one? The provisional government. It was formed by people who were standing there. But the liberals and the socialists still continued to fight for an elected government where everybody in Russia, where every citizen in Russia will have a chance to vote. And that was really difficult in those times. Look at the 2 points given on the screen. Restrictions were imposed on public meetings and associations earlier, right? Now those restrictions were removed after the revolution. Soviets like the Petrograd Soviet were set up everywhere. It's not that you just had one Petrograd Soviet, but many such Soviets were set up everywhere around Russia, though no common system of election was followed. So when you have such kind of bodies, people will get access to what is happening around the political system of Russia. So that is why such kind of bodies or offices were encouraged. In April 1917, so this happened in February, the February Revolution. After that, in April, the Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin returned to Russia from his exile. So he was not in scene when all this was happening. He was sent off to exile by the Tsar. So he came back in April. Remember that he was a leader of the Bolshevik group? Yes. So he and the Bolsheviks had opposed the war since 1914. They did not want war at all. Now he felt it was time for Soviets to take over power. So Soviets and the liberals were quiet all this while, and they were looking at how the provisional government was formed, how the strikers and workers went to fight the war in Petrograd, what happened after that. But still one point was lurking in their mind. What was it? Army officials, landowners and industrialists were influential in the provincial government. Was that right? So now Vladimir Lenin felt that the Soviets and the liberals should take over power. What did he do? This is very important. April thesis. The first point is, he declared that the war be brought to a close. No more war. Land should be transferred to the peasants. Banks should be nationalized, and these were the three demands of the Lenin's April thesis. These 3 points are very important. Along with the Bolshevik party, he came forward. He also argued that the Bolshevik party should be renamed as the Communist Party. This was the beginning of communism. From Karl Marx itself, communism started coming up to indicate its new radical aims. These were the 3 aims. So, Bolshevik party was no longer called as Bolshevik party, but Communist Party. Most others in the Bolshevik party were initially surprised by the April thesis. So everybody was shocked because he came back from the exile, and this is what he did. He demanded the government with so much of courage. They thought that the time was not yet ripe for a socialist revolution, and the provisional government needed to be supported. So people felt that just now a revolution got over. So why should there be the formation of another body? We already had Soviets all over Russia. Now why should we have another formation like the Communist Party? And people wanted to support the provisional government and not the Bolshevik party. Let's see what happened after that. But the developments of the subsequent months changed their attitude. So for the time being, they did not want to support the provincial government. But what happened after that? It is not that they did not support them for a longer time. Their attitude changed. people's attitude always change. It's not the same always, alright? So change. What was the change? Through the summer, the workers' movement spread. So workers were actually working hard towards these kind of movement against the government. In industrial areas, factory committees were formed which began questioning the way industrialists ran their factories. They were against how the factories were run. They really wanted an answer on why the factories were focusing on the interest of one particular person. Trade unions grew in number. Okay, so groups started forming, they started supporting each other. Soldiers' committees were formed in the army. So soldiers also joined them. So these points are important because this brought about the change. In June, what happened? About 500 Soviets. We saw that Soviets were formed. 500 Soviets sent representatives to an all-Russian Congress of Soviets. That's another body. They sent representatives. As the provincial government saw its power reduce and Bolshevik influence grow, it decided to take stern measures against the spreading discontent. Till then, people were actually working towards the progress of the living conditions of the workers. But did the provisional government give ears to that? No. It was a temporary quiet down which happened. Always it happens when there's an uprising by the majority of the people, the government will try to suppress it. And it was a temporary relief. Now, the provisional government saw that their power was reducing because everybody was standing unified for a cause. So they decided to take stern measures against the spreading discontent. It resisted attempts by workers to run factories and began arresting leaders because they understood, the provisional government understood that secret meetings were going on. People were planning out things. Okay. The second point, popular demonstrations staged by the Bolsheviks in July 1917 were sternly repressed. No more demonstrations, no more workers to run the factories. Many Bolshevik leaders had to go into hiding or flee. They had to just go, hide, flee. Who? The Bolshevik leaders. Meanwhile, what happened in the countryside? The peasants, we saw that the Russian peasants were really aggressive, right? They used to murder. We saw that in the previous audio. So now, in the countryside, peasants and their socialist revolutionary leaders pressed for a redistribution of land. They wanted the land to be redistributed to the people who really deserved it. Land committees were formed to handle this. So, people started forming land committees, workers' committees and all these things so that redistribution of land will take place. Encouraged by the socialist revolutionaries, peasants seized land between July and September 1917. So they were encouraged by the socialist groups. You should remember that the Bolsheviks leaders went into hiding. So now the socialists, you know that the Bolsheviks and the socialists were one? Yes. So now they came up, they supported the peasants to redistribute land. And what did the peasants do? They started seizing the land between July and September 1970. Okay? So now, the revolution of October 1917. Bolsheviks grew. Lenin feared the provisional government would set up a dictatorship. So Lenin also was maybe forced to flee. So now he feared that the provisional government will become a dictator. So what happened in September? He began discussions for an uprising against the government because now you have to use force. They were also using force. So now you have to use force. Bolshevik supporters in the army, Soviets and factories were brought together. So what did he do? He brought together the army, Soviets and the factory workers. It's a big group of the population, majority of the population. You should remember that the army also joined them. Yes. On 16 October 1917, so October 1917 revolution is very important. On 16 October 1917, Lenin really felt the need for an uprising because everybody was forced to flee. You should remember that the party was really strong. The government was really strong. Lenin persuaded the Petrograd Soviet and the Bolshevik Party to agree to a socialist seizure of power. So he made the Petrograd Soviet and the Bolshevik Party to join together, and they had to agree to the socialist seizure of power, because when you don't stand together, you cannot fight the present government. That is what he wanted. A military revolutionary committee, apart from the land committees, apart from the workers' committee. Why was those formed? So that they helped the peasants to help in redistribution of land. Do you remember that point in the previous slide? Okay. Now, the military revolutionary committee comprised of whom? Petrograd Soviet and the Bolshevik Party. It was appointed by the Soviet under Leon Trotsky, under a different leader, to organize the seizure. So these two were working together, operating together. Okay. The date of the event was kept a secret because there were a lot of restrictions on how people met, on how they actually focused on the political activities. So what did Lenin do? Once again, let's see. He decided that there has to be an uprising. He asked the Petrograd Soviet and Bolshevik Party to agree to a socialist seizure of power, where they did everything by force. And as a result of that, what was formed? Military Revolutionary Committee was formed under the leadership of Leon Trotsky.